Well, welcome everyone to the IISS this afternoon. It's good to see all of you here. My name is James Hackett. I'm editor of the Military Balance here at the Institute. This is the third talk in our sort of small series on Chinese military and security developments, and I'm glad to be able to introduce Nigel Inkster as our speaker today. For most of you, Nigel needs no introduction. He's been at the Institute since early 2007 and previously spent 31 years in SIS, including postings in Asia, Latin America and Europe. This, together with Nigel's current responsibilities as Director for Transnational Threats and Political Risk, which includes the development of the Institute's research activity on cybersecurity, means he's in a unique position to discuss developments in Chinese cyberpower. In today's talk, Nigel will offer an assessment of China's evolving cyber policies and capabilities, and will give insights into recent examples of cyber activities attributed to the Chinese state and its proxies. Nigel will speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll have ample time for discussion.
Well, thank you very much, James, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, for coming on such a nice sunny day to listen to me banging on about a subject on which I could bore for the universe. It's a very, very big subject to cover in the kind of time that we've got available. So I'll kick off very briefly, but first a brief word of product placement. I can do this without embarrassment because I derive no benefit from the sales of this book, but there is an essay in here written by me, which is a kind of sort of idiot's guide to the Chinese internet. So if you're interested, that is there and available. But I'd like to start by just giving a very brief indication of what China's internet and online activities look like. I've called it the Chinese ecosphere. And the numbers, are pretty eye-watering. Over 600 million users, making China the biggest, country of internet use on the planet. 80% of these users now accessing the internet through mobile technology, we've got a system within China where the state owns everything and leases it to companies, and we've basically got in terms of how it works, the dominance of so-called BAT, which is Baidu, the premier search engine, Alibaba, which is effectively online commerce, and Tencent in Chinese Tongxun, which is social media, and these three companies between them really do sort of dominate the market, and it is a very, very lively and active market. I don't know if this is going to work, but I'll just give you see if it doesn't. Oh yes, it does. Yeah, there you are. This is Alibaba main site, and if we sort of go down that and scroll down it, you can see it's kind of very. If I could scroll down it, you would. It's a very, very busy site filled with lots of detail, and accessing it is a bit like kind of accessing, doing your shopping in a supermarket. So you can find, for example, women's clothing market, sport and outside activities. Let's see. There are lots of different categories that you can get into, and Chinese online commerce has become absolutely huge in China. There is more of it than typically takes place in the United States, and what we actually have, get out of this, so I can't. Yeah, here we are. And I've called it, a vibrant and distinctive ecosphere. But I'll just talk for a second about how it works, because if you look at a site like Alibaba, it's been incredibly innovative in terms of developing all sorts of online services like third-party payment services and small loans in ways which are probably more innovative and creative than what one typically finds in the West. I mean, in Alibaba's online purchasing equivalent of what is the main Western online market? eBay, yeah. eBay. I mean, the Chinese equivalent of eBay, Taobao, has some amazing services. You know, for example, if you're a young Chinese girl about town and can't be bothered with irritating distractions like getting married and having children because you're just having too much fun, you can get your parents off your back by hiring an operational boyfriend who you can take with you to, meet the parents at Spring Festival or whatever, and thereby sort of get them off your back. So it is a very vibrant, and I would argue a sort of distinctive ecosphere. It's almost the reverse of the Columbus effect. When the first explorers, travelled to the New World, what they eventually worked out that they'd found was a completely distinctive ecosystem that had evolved completely separately from the one that they were familiar with, and that of course changed very quickly, the so-called Columbus exchange. And I think what we may be seeing in China is almost the reverse of that, something that started out being effectively the same ecosystem that we are familiar with, but which is actually evolving into something rather different and very distinctive. And it's not just a function of language, it's also about culture. But I would argue it's still actually quite a fragile ecosystem. And this is a lot to do with security concerns. And within China, at a kind of policy level, cybersecurity, or security of the net, is still a relatively embryonic concept. It didn't really feature in any official publications like white papers until around 2010. The primary concern for Chinese policymakers is actually this very, very heavy dependence on Western systems. Most official Chinese users who access the internet via desktop and laptop services are reliant on often pirated Windows XP, and Microsoft have just withdrawn support for Windows XP, and the Chinese government has actually ruled that official users are not allowed to migrate to Windows 8 because that's seen as a kind of major security threat in terms of the way in which the security updates and patches give access to the system and potentially act as a vector to transmit data back. But of course, I just said that 80% of access is now mobile, and so what that means is that whereas Microsoft was the kind of key villain in the Chinese piece, it's now Apple. The Chinese government has been pushing what they call indigenous innovation for some considerable time now, but with limited effect. If we look at what's out there and available within the Chinese indigenous sector, people like the People's Liberation Army, for example, now use a software system produced by a Shanghai corporation called Zhongbiao. I don't know much about this, but what little I do know, it seems very reminiscent of the government IT systems we used to use in the 1990s. Any of you who are familiar with them will know what the key characteristics were, namely clunky, limited functionality, and prone to fall over at the slightest provocation. The Chinese government has also expressed significant concern about the vulnerability of China's financial and banking sector that arises out of their dependency on IBM supercomputers, and are seeking to have these replaced by indigenous products. There's really only one company that I know of called Inspur, which potentially could produce these, but at the moment they're absolutely nowhere, and the reality is that the Chinese financial system is going to be dependent upon IBM for some considerable time to come. And with this, comes this fear, the sort of overarching concern the Chinese government has about the internet as a vector for subversion. I'll just read the key, highlights from PLA Daily op-ed dated August 2009, entitled "Internet Subversion: The Security Threat That Can't Be Ignored." And the key points of this are as follows. The West enjoys total dominance of the internet due to its ownership of the majority of hardware and software. It seeks to use the internet to spread subversion and promote its own worldview. The color revolutions in Moldova, Iran, were instigated via Twitter and Facebook. The US is seeking to replicate in cyberspace the dominance it already enjoys in all other military domains, as evidenced by the establishment of Cyber Command. So that is kind of, exemplifies what some of the Chinese government fears are. And the general insecurity of the Chinese internet is made worse by the fact that there are sort of very inadequate laws and even more inadequate implementation of these laws. And Chinese critics, this is not me talking, characterize Chinese legislation in this area as essentially sort of incoherent and lacking coordination, and basically rooted in a pre-information era mindset. Efforts are now in hand to try and get a grip on some of this. This year the Chinese created the leading small group on cyber issues and informatization, which is chaired by President Xi Jinping. And I interpret this as, at least part of an effort to get a better grip on an environment that is still, very, very poorly regulated in the sense that we would understand. And the other aspect of Chinese internet that I think is very important to understand is the effort and focus that the Chinese government devotes to filtering, monitoring and controlling internet content. And I've called this networked authoritarianism and the grass mud horse. And what we've got, a variety of means whereby the Chinese state is able to monitor the internet. The Great Firewall of China, more properly known as the Golden Shield project, which is what the Chinese characters say. The architect of that, Fang Bin-Sing, who I met, has become a kind of hate figure for the whole of China when he tried to open his own social media blog. He had to close it down because it became inundated with abusive and offensive content. And then you've got very, very complex mechanisms for internal content monitoring, which is done at various different levels: local, regional, national. And you also have the existence of effectively paid stooges, the so-called 50-cent party, based on the proposition that they get paid 50 cents, 5 mile, for every pro-government tweet or intervention that they put out on Chinese social media, and the expectation that service providers will exercise a high degree of self-censorship and not need to get told what to do, but will anticipate and police their own system. And this is where, get it right, this little guy comes in. I don't know if any of you recognize this, the grass mud horse, which has become a kind of icon of Chinese resistance to official censorship of social media and the internet. And of course, this phrase "cao ni ma," grass mud horse, is in fact a substitute for a phrase which means something rather different, pronounced "cao ni ma," which represents the typical reaction of Chinese internet users to finding that their content has been filtered or excised. And if I tell you that the second and third characters respectively mean your and mother, you can probably guess what the first character means. I raise this not to be intentionally scatological, but because it is emblematic of an entire kind of subculture of resistance with its own language and terminology, which is evolving all the time. And the other sort of principal actor in this drama is the river crab, 河蟹, or as it purports to represent 和谐, which is harmonization, which is in officialese what happens to your blog post when it gets taken down by the bogies. So the grass mud horse and the river crab have become these iconic figures of resistance and to censorship on the web. I now move on to cyber warfare, because this is something that Chinese military thinkers have given an awful lot of thought to. Having said that, there is virtually nothing available publicly in the way of official policies or doctrines on China's cyber warfare. That said, there is an awful lot of stuff that is being written about it in military-related journals and by Chinese scholars, including those with a military background. And this all really started, the Chinese focus on this really got started, as we all know, the first Gulf War, when the PLA was completely shocked to discover how advanced US precision-guided weaponry was, and what happened in the Kosovo conflict, where again the Chinese were able to observe at first hand the effectiveness of US cyber-enabled technologies, constituted major drivers to them to get started. The other kind of big catalyst to thinking on this was this well-known, I think by most of you now, book, Unrestricted Warfare, written by two PLA colonels, which looked at, amongst other things, US dependence on cyber-enabled capabilities as an asymmetric advantage which China could leverage for its own benefit as part of an approach to warfare which was kind of all-encompassing and going into areas that had not traditionally been seen as the province of armed conflict. That was fine as far as it went, but of course the Chinese military has actually been working very hard on catching up with American capabilities, and in so doing reducing that asymmetric advantage and putting themselves more, if you like, in harm's way. With this concept of fighting local wars under informationized conditions, which has been around since probably the turn of the millennium. I think it first appeared in the 2000 Defense White Paper, and has since undergone various evolutions: information networked electronic warfare, 网电一体战 in Chinese, and information confrontation, 信息对抗. And the father of information networked electronic warfare is a guy called Major General Dai Qingmin, who until recently was the head of the PLA General Staff's communications department. And I quote from an article in the Liberation Daily of September 2004. In future high-tech warfare, offensive operations will often necessitate preemptive destruction of the enemy's integrated battlefield command and control systems and warfare networks, and attacks on its state or military communications hubs, financial centres and C4 ISR systems, so as to directly affect the enemy's strategic decision-making. I also quote from an article in the January 2013 edition of Qiu Shi Party magazine, written by the former Deputy Chief of PLA General Staff Qi Jianguo, who led the Chinese delegation to the 2013 Shangri-La dialogue, which reads as follows: cybersecurity concerns national sovereignty as well as the security of economic and social operations, and it concerns the quality of human existence. The West's so-called internet freedom actually is a type of cyber hegemony. In the information era, seizing and maintaining superiority in cyberspace is more important than seizing command of the sea and command of the air was in World War II. So that, I think, sort of gives you, in a nutshell, the seriousness with which the PLA takes this. Who's doing it? Well, the military capability resides in two entities. The third department of the General Staff of the PLA, which is the Signals Intelligence Agency, and the fourth department, which is the Electronic Warfare Agency. And these are supplemented at various different levels. We can talk more about that if you want, with each of China's 7 military regions having its own technical reconnaissance bureau. The PLA Air Force, the PLA Navy also have their own technical reconnaissance bureaus. And what we've been seeing is a great emphasis in recent years on training and exercises in which cyber capabilities are integrated into other areas' activity, and with the aim of really achieving a kind of an approach which is similar in concept to US network-centric warfare, but perhaps with more of a focus on information operations, drawing on concepts which are very familiar to people who've studied these from the kind of Soviet era. The emphasis on information warfare, I think, is extremely important to understand within the Chinese context. And for the Chinese PLA, information warfare, information operations are something which are kind of integral to the entire campaign, but actually precede the campaign. There's something you do in peacetime as well. You're constantly conditioning the information environment, and at the same time protecting your own information space, which is part of the reason there is such a great focus on what the Chinese call information security, which I'll come to in a second. What we see is a lot of thinking and a lot of doctrine emerging, even though it's not officially acknowledged as such, on the incorporation of cyber capabilities into conventional military operations. What we see rather less of at the moment is thinking and writing on issues of deterrence and escalation in the cyber context. This is not that the Chinese military are not thinking about these things. I was invited last year to a meeting at the National Defense Technical University in Changsha and invited to give a keynote presentation on precisely this topic. So it is certainly very much in the minds of the Chinese military. But I think there is still, I sense, a reluctance to address the sort of possible nexus of issues that could potentially lead one from an incident in the cyber domain through stuff that happens in space to potentially full-blown nuclear confrontation, which is has to be the framework within which one thinks about these things. We're doing some work trying to engage with China on this. I have friends in the United States working on models of escalation and de-escalation, and the US in their engagement with Chinese military are starting to look at some issues, such as, for example, whether it might be possible for the two sides to agree not to target each other's critical national infrastructure, or to maybe use IPv6, the expansion of the domain name system, to identify potential targets that might get caught up in a conflict, and kind of separate them out, so identifying them as hospitals or schools or entities that should clearly not be targeted. But I'll come back to that in a second. Then the one that everybody's talking about, which is cyber espionage. And I think the genesis of this is Plan 863, the plan that was agreed in March 1986, hence the name, by Deng Xiaoping, as a means of enabling China to catch up with the West in areas of key strategic areas of science and technology. And Plan 863 has an overt component. It's about acquiring these capabilities in an above-board way, but also has for a long time had a significant covert component. And we have seen in the United States in particular a series of espionage cases involving the US defense sector, particularly in areas like nuclear weapons, aerospace, quiet submarine propulsion, and so on. But of course, cyber capabilities enable this kind of collection to be done in a way that is much easier, more efficient, and potentially less embarrassing, since it minimizes the risk that you have agents that are arrested and tried for various offenses. And we've seen since 2006, and that does seem to be a kind of date at which things really kicked off, and a more or less endless succession of allegations of what amounts to state-sponsored industrial espionage on an industrial scale, focusing on areas of science, technology, and commercial activity that certainly are of strategic relevance to China. I'm not going to go through a great long list of all these things. They've been characterized collectively as the biggest transfer of wealth the world has ever seen by Keith Alexander, former director of NSA. Personally, I question whether it's possible to make such an assertion with any conviction. And I would just like to point out that actually, in this picture here, we're looking at probably one of the most serious, advanced, persistent threats, that icon of our times, the corporate executive who doesn't get cyber security. And the fact is that a lot of the intrusions that have been registered over the last almost decade now have their origins in a pretty lackadaisical corporate approach to fairly basic cyber hygiene. That we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. So, who's doing all of this stuff? Is it actually China? Well, I think if you want to find a beyond reasonable doubt evidential case that would stand up in a court of law, you're going to struggle to do that. That is in the nature of these exercises. But if you look at this from a more probabilistic perspective, I think then it becomes rather easier to identify the likely culprits. I mean, it is true, and Chinese have made the point, that China is an attractive intermediate waypoint for other malevolent actors, precisely because of the very poor cybersecurity that I referred to earlier. But, if you look at these attacks, most of them track back to China, to servers in China. And then if you ask the question, cui bono, who benefits, it's pretty hard to see who else might be doing this at the kind of level that we are seeing. And even if some of these exploits are not actually attributable to the Chinese state, and I think they're not, you've got to wonder whether in a country where individual social media posts can be monitored and tracked, it's possible for large-scale cyber intrusions, advanced persistent threats over long periods of time involving enormous consumption of bandwidth could go undetected, and if it's not the Chinese state, well, what are they doing about it? But I think what we've got actually is what we have had is a pretty chaotic environment in which some of this collection is certainly done by professional signals intelligence agency. If you look at, for example, the attempt to access the secure ID tokens used by RSA for US defense contractors, that was a complex multi-phase operation that started with a targeting exercise using LinkedIn and Facebook, and then sort of gradually narrowing in so as to identify potential recipients of spear phishing activities, combined with some very, very complicated work to track and monitor the constantly changing algorithms that were an important function of this particular security system. The use of separate breach and exfiltration teams, all of these behaviors suggest that you're talking about some very, very high-end professional, certainly state directed activities. But what you also got in China, and it needs to be recognized, is a system where a lot of private actors are engaged at multiple levels with multiple identities, sometimes acting on their own behalf, sometimes acting on behalf of commercial companies, sometimes operating with, to all intents and purposes, letters of marque from the Chinese government, rather like the 18th century privateers, and the existence of militia organizations such as the one that was whose activities were revealed by the US security firm Mandiant last year, and which kind of elevated this to the status that it now has, namely a major irritant, major issue in Sino-US relations. And the latest stage in this whole dynamic was the Department of Justice indictments against 5 named 3PLA militia officers, which has had the byproduct of causing Global Times to achieve a new nadir in its undeclared mission to inflict grievous bodily harm on the English language by accusing the United States of being mincing rascals. I'm not quite sure where that term derives from, because it wasn't a translation of Chinese. Now, I just wanted to I don't know if this is going to work, but I thought it'd be worth just giving it a go, seeing if we can get this to, here we go. Of course, typically we won't see. This is, an effort to sort of track detectable cyber intrusions that are taking place in real time on the planet at any given moment. So I'm trying to stick with China, and if you look there on the map, you can see that there's an awful lot of stuff happening, and most of it's heading in one direction. I looked at it earlier this morning, and there was quite a strong thread heading down towards Australia. This is dynamic, but it keeps on changing all the time. But you can see that pretty consistently, the United States is the kind of number one offender, if you like, but China is pretty much up there as the second. Now, this is all sort of exploits, detectable malware that is sort of emanating from China, heading for somewhere. This is something I pinched from The Economist, which identifies how do we do this? It's not how we get. Oh, sorry. Go back. Which identifies the particular targets that were being pursued by one group of Chinese hackers over quite a long period of time. It actually goes through to 2012, but my IT competence is not sufficient to bring it right across. Anyway, the fact is there's a lot of it about, and the US argumentation in all of this is that there is a qualitative difference between what the US, the NSA, is doing, as revealed by Edward Snowden, of which more in a moment, and state-sponsored industrial espionage. And the US argumentation is basically as follows. There is no international law that limits or proscribes state-on-state espionage. Espionage occupies an intermediate position in international law. It's neither expressly permitted nor expressly proscribed. But when it comes to industrial espionage, there is this international treaty, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, which does actually require governments to protect intellectual property and set some fairly high standards for doing this. And the U.S. argument has been that what we're seeing this industrial espionage taking place is effectively a massive violation of an international treaty commitment, and it's something that the United States doesn't do. China has been massively unpersuaded by this proposition, and the Snowden revelations have kind of lent weight to its response. And earlier this year, in May 2014, China's Internet Media Research Center produced a report entitled The United States Global Surveillance Record, which inter alia has the following points in it. So I'll get up to that. As a superpower, the United States takes advantage of its political, economic, military, and technological hegemony to unscrupulously monitor other countries, including its allies. The United States spying operations have gone far beyond the legal rationale of anti-terrorism and have exposed its ugly face of pursuing self-interest in complete disregard of moral integrity. These operations have flagrantly breached international laws, not sure about that, which ones, seriously infringed upon the human rights and put global cybersecurity under threat. They deserve to be rejected and condemned by the whole world. So there we are, the mincing rascals in the dock. This was, we witnessed after the Department of Justice indictments a kind of upsurge in Chinese commentary on Snowden, about which China had been largely silent up until that point, primarily because, of course, the Snowden revelations were doing for China a lot of what it wanted to do in the international arena, namely to weaken and erode US dominance in the cyber domain. And internationally, China has for some time been promoting an agenda which focuses on cyber sovereignty and has been very active in global debates on global governance and the global cyber security. The UN governmental group of experts, which last June, rather against expectation, managed to achieve a compromise document which involved a trade-off between accepting the Chinese proposition and Russian proposition that state sovereignty should apply in the cyber domain versus the US and allied position that existing international law should also apply in the cyber domain. And there's a particular aspect of this which is interesting and has the potential to evolve into something that will run for some time, and I'll end with this, is that the US promptly said, okay, international law, that means international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict applies in the cyber domain. To which the Chinese and the Russians said, hang on a minute, we're not so sure about this. And now this is not that the Chinese, of course, are saying, well, international humanitarian law is not part of, international law. Of course they recognize that is the case. But what they have are some quite serious questions which do need to be addressed about how this would actually work in practice, how you would apply the requirements of distinction, proportionality in a domain where it's very difficult to separate out military from civilian capabilities. How would things like neutrality work if you're going to launch an exploit against another state? Chances are it's going to go through the networks of a third party. 50% likelihood that it would actually go through the United States of America. Would that make the United States of America a belligerent in this conflict? I think we can know what the answer to that is. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and actually this is something that we in IISS are starting to work on with Chinese counterparts, with Chinese scholars, to see if we can actually come up with some sensible ideas on how we might do this. And I think there is a huge amount to be done in this domain, because internationally, whether in terms of governance or security, what China is prepared to sign up to with other major players like the United States and Russia to a lesser extent is likely to become normative, simply because it's hard to see how norms and rules of the road are going to be capable of being developed between a large number of states with very different perspectives. So I suspect that entities like the UN Governmental Group of Experts, UNGGE, will ultimately have as a primary purpose the socialization of whatever countries like China and the USA can agree to. I'm sorry, there's a very, very rapid canter over the turf. I went on for longer than I'd planned to do, and there were many things I could have covered in much more detail and failed dismally to do. But I will end there and open up the floor for discussions and comments.
If anyone would like to ask a question, just raise your hand and we'll come to you, and please state your affiliation first.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. I would like to ask the indigenous innovation and also subcultural resistance. So China has an intention to invent like a World Wide Web. Mm-hmm. And secondary is subcultural resistance. So what kind of political tendency and scale? So for example, grass force has, and we can connect to this organization.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on the first question, yes, China is working to develop indigenous capabilities, and for example, one of the things it's doing is developing an alternative to GPS, the Beidou satellite network, which is now regional and has ambitions to go global. I'm not so sure about developing an alternative Chinese internet. I'm more sceptical about whether that intention really exists or whether it's realizable in the short term. But certainly, I don't think we should. Nobody should ever be complacent about Chinese capability for innovation. That I think would be a serious error. On the question of the sort of cyber resistance, I mean, I think what we've got is a sort of constant cat and mouse game. I mean, I use the term networked authoritarianism. That is not my term. It's actually a term coined by a young US researcher by the name of Rebecca McKinnon, and she describes it very, very well. And I'll just sort of read you a few sentences from a report she produced for the US Congress a couple of years ago. So this new form of internet age authoritarianism embraces the reality that people cannot be prevented from accessing and creating a broad range of internet content. Networked authoritarianism accepts a lot more give and take between government and citizens than a pre-internet authoritarian regime. The regime uses the internet not only to extend its control but also to enhance its legitimacy. While one party remains in control, a wide range of conversations rage on websites and social networking services. As a result, people with internet or mobile access have a much greater sense of freedom and may even feel they can influence government behavior in ways that weren't possible under classic authoritarianism. It also makes people a lot less likely to join a protest movement calling for radical political change. Meanwhile, the government exercises targeted censorship, focusing on activities that pose the greatest threat to the regime's power. It also devotes considerable resources to seeding and manipulating the nation's online discourse about domestic and international events, which is the 50-cent party that I referred to. So this is a constant, ongoing action-reaction dynamic. Sometimes the government's ahead of the game. Sometimes netizens feel that maybe they're ahead of the game. All I would say is, so far, I think the Chinese state has demonstrated considerable ingenuity, determination, and resilience in keeping on top of this. Whether they will continue to do so, history alone will tell us.
Who else would like to ask a question?
Just to follow on from the 50 Cent Party, and Nick Papadimitriou, I'm here for Lady Kennett on her behalf. Just to follow on from the 50 Cent Party and just move slightly away from China for a moment. It's just an intriguing idea to me. Do other nation states have similar organisations to promote the view of the government or the dominant party? I'm thinking here particularly of Russia and some of the debates I've seen around the Ukraine, where you get the feeling that commentators are, if not actually in uniform, serving the issue, the interests of the military.
Yeah, there are a number of different ways in which countries are doing this. One thing they do is create the walled garden. So a country like Kazakhstan, for example, will enable the state communications agency to provide free content to the population. So basically, most people only care about local issues, and so they will happily, operate within the walled garden. They can get outside, but they've got to pay for it, and it's expensive, and therefore, they don't particularly want to. And it's a bit the same in China. I mean, you can get around the Great Wall of China if you really want to do so, the Great Firewall of China if you want to do so. If you really, really need to, access, the BBC News website, it's perfectly possible to do that. I would simply observe that, the Chinese, China is not full of frustrated individuals, who can't, access the BBC website or the Falun Gong website or the Free Tibet website. They really don't care about these things because they're much, more important things to do. In Russia, it's a combination of things. Yes, certainly, there's a lot of, manipulation, but in the Russian case, it's more a question of collecting everything through the SORM 2 exercise. Basically, service providers have got to collect everything and deliver a copy to the FSB, And then if the FSB go through this and find something they don't like, what's likely to happen is the person concerned will get a phone call from somebody who doesn't identify him or herself because they don't need to, and that person will then explain the facts of life. And most people at that point recognise the facts of life and stop doing whatever it is. So there are different ways of doing this. Yeah, but it's quite pervasive.
Sorry, by the door.
Craig Edwards from BP. Can I ask, when you showed the image earlier for the network attack that was being undertaken from China, do you think that is representative of China actually carrying out more espionage in other countries, or do you think actually it could be reflective of its lack of global passive collection that many of its critics will possess?
A good question. I think that the sort of levels of activity are probably second only to those of the United States in terms of the intensity of collection that's going on. A lot of people have commented on the fact that many of these Chinese attacks are not particularly well concealed. For example, the tradecraft is often pretty lax. I mean, if you look at the unit that was investigated by Mandiant, you could pretty much set your watch by their activities. They'd start at 9, at 12 o'clock on the dot, i.e. Chinese lunch hour, they'd knock off. An hour for lunch, an hour for xiuxi break, for siesta, then back on again, and then off again, and nothing happening during the Spring Festival and other Chinese holidays, etc., etc. But I mean, I think a lot of that is a reflection of the fact that in this business you don't deploy more tradecraft than you need to deploy. And a lot of the techniques that were being used are pretty sort of bog standard spear phishing and other techniques. They work, So I mean, I think and there isn't the sort of overall sort of top-down rigid control that actually an entity like NSA is much more subject to, not to mention laws and little things like that, which 3PLA I don't think are overly troubled by. So I think what you see is what you get. The activity is real, and it is multi-purpose. I should have mentioned also that the collection is not just about the sort of high-tech sector and areas like oil and gas exploration, where the Chinese state has some critical issues to worry about. We also see quite a lot of activity undertaken by the Ministry of State Security against dissident groups, Free Tibet, etc., etc. There was a major investigation done in 2009 by the Information Warfare Center at Monk School in Canada, GhostNet, looking at intrusions into the networks of the Free Tibet movement, the Dalai Lama, which ended up encompassing targets in I think 109 different countries. So that's going on as well.
Yes, further down towards the back.
Hi, it's Chris Brennan, freelance journalist. I have a question about cyber warfare. Could you possibly give a little bit more detail on where that capability is coming from? I know you said it's not necessarily clear if it's state-sponsored or primarily within the state, but who's developing those techniques and technologies?
Well, if we're talking about cyber warfare, then it is the state, it is the Chinese military, it is 3PLA, it is 4PLA, it is the general staff of the PLA. That are working to develop the capabilities, the doctrines, the training schedules, that collectively would make up this capability. Now there is the issue of cyber militias and the role that they might play in the event of any particular conflict. And in a way, this is conceptually not a lot different from what the British military is now doing with the reserve, for example, where the British military is looking to leverage civilian expertise in the cyber domain in order to enhance its capabilities in times of need. And I believe that the PLA sees some of these cyber militias within that context. Just how well disciplined and under control they might turn out to be in time of conflict remains to be determined. But when we're talking about cyber warfare as such, it is very clearly driven by the military. And I would emphasise that I don't think the military don't see cyber warfare. They don't see cyber warfare as bringing the enemy to its knees with the click of a mouse. But one important strand of Chinese thinking, in the use of cyber in military operations, is the potential to utilize information operations to kind of erode the enemy's will to fight. Going back to the sort of Sun Tzu concept of a victory without having to fight, 不战而胜. And that element is certainly very much in Chinese military thinking. But I think that overall what we're looking at is the use of cyber capabilities as an adjunct to and a part of conventional military operations rather than something which is kind of freestanding. Just to make that clear.
Ahmet Kalafat from Turkish Embassy. Although it's isolated from the world, North Korea is trying to develop some kind of cyber, capabilities.
Yeah.
What's the role of China? Do you have any for this?
Well, it's very interesting because I think China does have a role. The North for a country, a tiny proportion of whose population actually has internet connectivity. North Korea has devoted a lot of time and effort to developing some quite sophisticated cyber capabilities through some of its key point universities. And they have developed a corpus of engineers who are whose own indigenous training is supplemented by training in countries like China and Russia, and there is some evidence to suggest that Unit 121 of the Korean People's Army, which is their sort of primary cyber operations unit, does actually have a base in Shenyang in China. Certainly a lot of the attacks that are attributed to North Korea Unit 121 do seem to be routed through Chinese IP addresses. And again, the point I made earlier, in a country where individual social media postings are monitored, hard to imagine that attacks this big involving this amount of bandwidth don't get noticed.
Kiri.
Thank you very much for your talk. I had a question about, you talked about how there's a high level of sort of network authoritarianism. You also talked about how the regulatory framework was inadequate and they're still trying to build that. And those two things, I don't quite understand sort of how they exist in tension to each other.
Well, I think the part of the problem is that a lot of the effort and capabilities that might otherwise be directed towards achieving a more stable and hygienic network are actually being diverted into information content control. We're talking of tens of thousands of people here, operating at different levels, and it is the content control that is receiving all the attention, all the resources. If some of that manpower, some of that money, some of that capability was actually being devoted to clamping down on the huge levels of indigenous IP theft and hacking that are going on within China, and more focus directed towards creating a stronger and more cohesive network of laws governing such activity, which Chinese thinkers and policymakers recognise they need to do. I'm not saying they're sitting there thinking, hey, we've got the Wild East, isn't this great? They do recognise the need to tighten up their acts. But of course, it's hard to do given that so many of the potential resources available are directed elsewhere.
Nigel, I'm bringing Matt Holmes from the MOD. What do you think the longer term trends will be in cyber, and in particular cyber warfare and threats?
Oh my God! An easy question. I wish I could come up with a really snappy one-line response to that, but it's not going to happen. Well, certainly for China, they have aligned themselves, publicly with Russia around this international code of conduct, which seeks, amongst other things, to prescribe research into cyber weapons and to actually, achieve some kind of quasi-arms control regime that would cover the cyber domain. I think most of us take the view that something like that is inherently improbable because of the total impossibility of verification. So my basic sense is that the concept of I don't like the term cyber weapons because I'm not quite sure what it means. I don't think anybody quite sure what it means. But the use of cyber capabilities for combat or warfare purposes is out there. I know within the Chinese media, the USA is excoriated for having sort of started this trend through the creation of Cyber Command. But the reality is that it's out there. People are using this, and there is a growing recognition that this is an area where the barriers to entry are particularly low. Anyone can pretty much get into this game, though size and overall capabilities still count for a lot. So I think we are going to see increasing tendency to want to acquire, develop, use these capabilities. I was talking to somebody from one of the big technology majors at a talk I gave when I said I thought there were in excess of 30 states that were now had both the capabilities and the intentions to develop effectively military cyber capabilities, and his response was, "Are you sure that's all there are? That number seems low to me. Every day we get requests from governments for information about capabilities which can only serve the purposes of subversion or offence." So I think this is a growing trend, and there is going to be an urgent imperative to start thinking about this in a more strategic context and to consider ways in which we're not going to get the genie back into the bottle. Can we actually control it? Can we manage it? Can we develop some mechanisms and policies for mitigating the escalatory potential of these capabilities? I think that is really, really important. When I was talking in China last year at the National Defense Technical University, I made the point that there are a lot of cyber activity, as we just mentioned, coming out of North Korea that has a Chinese IP address attached to it. Imagine the situation if one of those North Korean attacks went further than anyone had intended, elicited a US escalatory response, which was directed not against North Korea but against China, because that's where the threats seem to be coming from. We need to start, we need to develop a whole corpus of thinking to address some of these issues. It's something we in IISS are becoming very much more involved with. And one of the things we're looking to do is to develop a much more authoritative inventory of military cyber capabilities owned by states, partly in the hope that may serve part of a wider confidence building and de-escalatory process. But we're in the foothills of that. We're exploring some of this with Chinese and hopefully soon Russian counterparts. But this is early days.
I could maybe just add a little bit on the trends issue. I mean, it's cyber and networking, of course, affects conventional weapons more generally, the systems held by armed forces. And I sort of wonder if a trend in China could be similar to that seen in Western armed forces in recent years, in the sense of trying to reduce dependence on networking in the information space, trying to effectively harden old technologies and modernize and miniaturize them, so that sort of the increasing competition in the information space is managed, I suppose, better by armed forces. Could I just maybe ask the last one before we wrap up? You spoke. The graphics were very instructive about the seemingly one-way traffic at certain points in the day. But to what degree is you talk about how cyber can be used to condition the environment? To what degree is there sort of local conditioning in the sense of regional political disputes in the Asia Pacific? I mean, how much is that part of this sort of wider cyber activity, more politically focused activity rather than commercial?
It happens in various levels, of course, and I mentioned already in the case of China efforts to erode confidence in US capabilities and to call into question their bona fides and intentions. I think that if you look at governments dealing with contested areas, East China Sea, South China Sea, you're increasingly seeing countries like Japan, Vietnam, engaging in the cyber dimension as part of a kind of sort of ongoing information exchange, trying to sort of get their points across and establish a narrative that is favourable to their particular position. And of course, it's something China is doing all the time. So I think we see this is not just limited to the Asia Pacific region. We're seeing it, of course, now with Ukraine. We see it in Syria. We see it almost anywhere now where conflict exists. There is a cyber there is an information operations dimension to whatever campaign is going on, with each side trying to shape the narrative in ways favourable to it.
Well, let's draw formal proceedings to a close there. Thanks very much, Nigel. I think you'll all agree it's been a fascinating talk this afternoon, and I'm sure Nigel will be around for a few minutes if some of you want to discuss other questions informally with him, but please join me in formally thanking him for this afternoon's talk.